Magona Marima, welcome to this edition of Magona Marima, Academy of Crop Production. This is episode 8, and we continue this week talking about fertilizing maize for a productive harvest. Now there's two things that we need to think about when we come to deciding how much fertilizer do we need to apply to our maize crop. The first is, what is the nutrient requirement of our maize crop? And the second thing is, what is the nutrient supply capacity of our soil? Now, last episode we spoke a little bit about how to do a soil sample to obtain a soil test result that will tell us what is the nutrient supply capacity of our soil. But I'd like to begin this week by talking about what is the nutrient requirement of our crop. Maize is a nutrient demanding crop. You cannot grow a good crop of maize without applying fertilizer, generally speaking. When we think about maize, the amount of nutrients that it requires depends on the yield that you expect to get from that crop. You can imagine that. A low-yielding crop requires very little nutrients. A high-yielding crop requires a lot of nutrients. Now, a lot of research has been done on this, and on average, we can say that maize that is going to yield a good crop requires a certain amount of nutrients per ton of grain. The three big nutrients in maize are nitrogen, phosphate, and potassium. For each ton of grain that you produce in a maize field, you need about 20 kilograms of nitrogen, 9 kilograms of phosphate, and 24 kilograms of potassium or potash. So that's per ton. You'll also need a certain amount of sulfur. It's about 6 or 7 kilograms per ton. You'll also need other nutrients for your maize crop. Sulfur requires about 3 to 4 kilograms per ton. Calcium, about the same, 3 or 4 kilograms per ton. And magnesium, about 4 kilograms per ton. And then there's a whole lot of micronutrients that are required in very small quantities. For example, zinc. Zinc is required at a rate of about 0.05 kilograms per ton, and likewise boron and molybdenum are required in those very small amounts. So when you look at that array of nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, those three are called macronutrients, together sometimes with sulfur, calcium, and magnesium, because they're required in a fairly large amount. And the micronutrients are all the things like zinc, boron, molybdenum, copper, and there are many others. You can think of it like your food. You like a big plate of sadza. Sadza is a little bit like the nitrogen for maize. It needs it in large quantities. The meat and the vegetables are a little bit like the phosphate and potash. And then the salt and the pepper and the other things that you put on to make the taste nice are the things like sulfur, calcium, magnesium, and the other micronutrients. So let's think about a crop of, say, 5 tons per hectare. A 5 ton per hectare maize crop will need at least 100 kilograms of nitrogen, about 45 kilograms of phosphate, and about 120 kilograms of potash. If you can supply that, or that plant can obtain those nutrients from the soil, and everything else is good, that crop should be able to give you that 5 or 6 tons per hectare. So that's the nutrient requirement of the crop. So you need to set a yield target for your maize. What is my yield target for this year in my environment? Is it 3 tons? Is it 6 tons? Is it 9 tons? Maybe it's even 12 tons. Well, with that yield target, you can then see what your nutrient requirement is for your crop. Once you've established that, then we go to our soil and we find out what is the nutrient supply capacity of our soil. Remember in the last episode I said productive soils are always fertile, but fertile soils are not always productive. So if you want to be productive, you must have a fertile soil. Soil fertility is more than just the nutrients in the soil. It covers things like the structure of the soil, the kind of soil that you have, whether it's sandy or clay. It considers the amount of organic matter in the soil and how you have cared for that soil. So in other words, an eroded soil is not going to be very fertile. But a soil that has been cared for over the years through the application of manure, conservation agriculture, the application of lime and fertilizer, and returning the nutrients back into the soil through the residues, that soil will be fertile. But one of the ways to evaluate particular nutrients is to get the soil samples analyzed. We spoke about how to do a soil analysis. You submit those samples, you get the results, and you look at those results together with an agronomist who can interpret those results for you, and they will come up with recommendations. Now, for example, you might get the soil analysis result back from the lab, and it says that the phosphate level is 20 parts per million. Now, when they do that soil test, they do a test that helps us get a feel, an understanding of what is available. So, if the soil test says that it has 20 parts per million of phosphate, that basically means that that is the amount of phosphate that is available to the plant. Okay, so 20 parts per million. What does that mean to us as a farmer? Well, if you look at a hectare of your field, how much soil is there in 1 hectare of your field? Well, most of the nutrients are going to be absorbed from the top 15 centimeters of your soil. That's where you apply your fertilizer. That's where the most organic matter is. If you take 1 hectare by 15 centimeters deep, that's equivalent to about 2 million kilograms of soil. 2,000 tons of soil in 1 hectare in which the nutrients are going to be available to the crop. Particularly things like the nutrients that are applied with fertilizer. So, 20 parts per million of phosphate on 1 hectare of land is equivalent to, close enough, 40 kilograms of phosphate per hectare. How did I do that calculation? 2 million kilograms times 20 parts per million. So for every million kilograms of soil, there's 20 kilograms of phosphate. But we've got 2 million kilograms in 1 hectare of soil. So 2 times 20 is 40 kilograms of phosphate per hectare. Now, we go back to what we were talking about right at the beginning, or where we started. A 5-ton crop of maize requires about 45 kilograms of phosphate. That's for the grain and the stover. Our soil, if we have a phosphate level of 20 parts per million, will supply 40 kilograms of phosphate. It's about the same amount that the plant requires. And therefore, in that situation, I don't have to put on much phosphate fertilizer to feed my maize. But now we have to think, is 20 parts per million of phosphate a fertile soil? Well, in my estimation, 20 parts per million is a kind of a marginal phosphate level. I would want to see the phosphate level going up above 20. Therefore, if you want to build your soil fertility, you would want to apply more fertilizer than what the soil can supply, so that what the crop takes out of the soil is what it needs, and the fertilizer that you apply provides the fertilizer for that crop and to build the soil fertility. So those kinds of reasoning, thinking, needs to be considered for all the nutrients that the soil test result gives you an analysis of. Now in Zimbabwe, our soil test results tell us something about the nitrogen level in the soil. It tells us about the phosphate level and these cations like calcium, magnesium, and potassium. And we need to look at each one of those and also the ratio of these nutrients with one another. Now this can get a little bit complicated for a brief discussion like this. But basically, when you get the test result, sit down with your agronomist and help him or ask him to help you interpret the results so that you get a much better understanding of the fertility status of your soil. Once you have an understanding of the fertility status of your soil, then you can begin to work out the fertilizer application that you need for your crop. Now, too many cases in Zimbabwe, I think, are pretty much a thumb suck on how much fertilizer to apply to our maize crop. You know, we say, okay, let's put 5 bags of D and 4 bags of AN per hectare. Now that might work, generally speaking. But really, it's a thumb suck. It's not really a good way of doing things. And that's why we would recommend that you take a soil sample, submit that to a lab, get the results back, evaluate the fertility of your soil, make an estimate of your yield goal, set yourself a goal for this year, and then match those two things, the fertility of the soil and your yield goal, to calculate how much fertilizer you require. Then, once you do that, you can then think about the economics of it. For example, let's say you put 200 kilograms of D onto your field. How much is that going to cost you? It'll cost you about $140, $150. If you put on 300 kilograms of AN, how much will that cost you? It'll cost you about $220 per hectare. So combine those two, you're going to come up to about $350 per hectare. You need at least 1 ton of grain. More, maybe, depending on the price. But you need at least 1 ton of grain to cover that cost of fertilizer. And so economics becomes a very important part of this equation of how much fertilizer to apply. So, set your yield goal, evaluate your fertility, determine what would be the optimum fertilizer to apply, and then think about the economics. The higher the price of the maize, the more fertilizer you can put. The lower the price of maize, the more conservative you have to be in the amount of fertilizer you apply. But you can work that all out once you've set your yield goal and once you know the fertility of your soil. So I hope that's been helpful to you. In the next episode, we're going to talk about how much fertilizer to apply and what kinds of fertilizer to apply, when it is best to apply them, and how best to apply them. So thank you for watching this episode. I look forward to being with you again in the next episode. Bye now.